This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now that face-to-face conferences are slowly becoming a possibility again in many parts of the world, it's a great time to make sure you're plugged into what's going on. Take a look at ASA's website or follow them on social media to stay up to date with events of interest to the animal studies community. Or, better yet, become a member of ASA. You can join today for just 60 Australian dollars if you're a waged academic, or just 15 Australian dollars if you're unwaged, precariously waged, a student, or similar. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. Did you know that there are 2 open access books in the series? This means that they're free for anyone to read online, download, or print. One of them is Animal Welfare in Australia by Peter John Chen. The other is Fighting Nature, Travelling Menageries, Animal Acts and War Shows by Peter Tate. And speaking of animals and war, let me introduce you to today's guest. Dr. Blake Hereth is a philosopher who is, at the time of recording, a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Arkansas. They will soon be taking up a Postdoctoral Research Fellowship at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell, where they'll be contributing to a project entitled Warfighter Participation in the Development and Testing of Artificial Intelligence. In addition to work on the ethics of war and peace, which is what we'll be discussing today, Blake has published on a range of topics in philosophy and theology, including work on the ethics of procreation, the ethics of eating, and the afterlife for animals and queer people. Today, we're going to talk about Blake's paper, Rights Pacifism, which was published online first in the journal Philosophical Studies earlier this year. Welcome to the podcast, Blake.
Thanks for having me, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to work on this topic?
Sure. I grew up in the U.S., in the state of Georgia, in the capital city of Atlanta, and frequently vacationed with my family in Florida. On the drive down there one summer, I noticed a PETA billboard that pictured a great white shark with a human leg in its mouth. The caption read, "Payback is hell." That really fascinated me and got me thinking. Most shark attacks are provoked, and it seems odd to blame or cull sharks for maiming or killing humans in self-defense. Of course, sharks probably aren't moral agents in any robust sense, but even so, we don't usually regard self-defensive behavior as the sort of behavior that makes an individual problematically dangerous. So around 2014, I started to think about this more seriously and was surprised to find a rather anemic literature on the topic of animal rights and self-defense.
This is a paper that's responding to what you call the militancy objection to animal rights. Could you explain what that is?
Certainly. So the militancy objection to animal rights, as I understand it, is just the objection, perhaps to oversimplify it a bit, that if animals have robust moral rights of comparable strength to the sort of basic moral rights possessed by human beings, then they would have rights to defensive assistance. So usually we think that not only do human beings have the right to self-defense, but for third parties are permitted to intervene and defend parties who are engaged in justified self-defense. So if you unjustly try to kill me and I attempt to defend myself and I'm not doing a terribly good job of it, a third party is permitted to intervene and assist me. And when applied to non-human animals, that carries some rather radical implications. It seems to imply, for example, that, in cases where, say, zoos, right, if there's going to be a culling at the zoo, or if animals are imprisoned at zoos, which I think they are, that they are, in effect, kidnapped or are being unjustly harmed or unjustly incarcerated or something like that, and that being unable to defend themselves and free themselves, third parties are permitted to use violent means, perhaps maybe even horrifically violent means, to aid them in their escape.
I see. And so that's an objection because it seems counterintuitive that it's okay to commit these acts of violence to protect animals.
That's right. So I do think that to some extent it's intuitive. For instance, I think a lot of people have the intuition that if someone is hurting your dog, right, and the only way that you can avert the harm to your dog is by hitting the person or causing them some sort of minimal physical harm, that you're permitted to do that. The killing human beings in defense of non-human animals, or seriously maiming them, that's where things get a little bit hazy. So I was interested in approaching this paper two reasons. One is because I'm just generally interested in the question, giving this, anecdote from my upbringing. And secondly, because I think that, when it comes to non-human animals, there's sort of a vague, a sort of hazy case where we're not exactly sure what to think about killing or seriously maiming human beings in their defense. And I thought that would be a nice opportunity to leverage the presence and seemingly unnoticed status of non-human animals in the self-defense literature as a way, in favor of a pacifist conclusion.
Yeah, good. So this pacifist conclusion is one of the really interesting parts about the paper, because you suggest that there are two plausible answers to this militancy objection. I know you explore others, and we'll hopefully get to them in a second. But the two realistic answers, you think, are number one, we endorse militancy, we bite that bullet, and number two, we endorse pacifism. So could you introduce us to these two possibilities?
Certainly. So, in terms of endorsing militancy, it's rather exactly what it sounds like. So, to my knowledge, only a couple people have endorsed or come close to endorsing this sort of view in print. One of them is Ivor Hardman, which is a pseudonym paper, In Defense of Direct Action, which was just recently published in the so-called Journal of Controversial Ideas. And the other is Cheryl Abate, who suggests that human beings might in some cases be liable and may not be permitted to defend themselves against animals in certain kind of cases where they're responsible for introducing or forcing a conflict. But the militancy option is exactly what it sounds like. Essentially, it's the view that, third parties, you and me, right, we are permitted, if not morally required, but at least permitted to take up arms in defense of non-human animals, to kill zookeepers or seriously maim them, right? Whatever harms are really necessary, and poachers and hunters and so on and so forth. So in a way, it's a sort of bite the bullet sort of option for militancy. Pacifism, on the other hand, is really just the flip. In the paper, I just compare it to the sort of flip side of the coin, where militancy is a quite liberal, very permissive view about defensive violence. It's rather expansive. And pacifism, by contrast, is a very restrictive or conservative view about violence. It says, well, now that we've seen some reason to think that we should treat like cases alike, and that defending humans from against unjust harms is morally comparable to defending non-human animals against unjust harms, then either we're permitted to defend both those groups or defend neither of those groups. And so those, it seems to me, are the two sides of the coin. Now, in a very early version of the paper, I didn't endorse one of these conclusions or the other. I said, I think it's interesting enough that at least one of these conclusions is true. And even if we don't know which one, there's nothing mealy-mouthed about it, right? Both of these conclusions are quite radical. So I really don't think that there is a happy, non-radical middle solution here.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So pacifism, it's a nice sounding word. It's the sort of thing we might want to get behind. But it's actually a pretty controversial conclusion in this context. So correct me if I'm wrong. It seems like endorsing pacifism means that we can never use violence to defend ourselves or to defend others, whether that's animals or humans. So, for example, I'm not allowed to fight back if I'm attacked, or if my partner's attacked, or the example you gave before, if my dog's attacked. And if I'm right about that, it seems like a very big bullet to bite. It seems like both options are kind of bullet-biting options, even to avoid something as controversial as the militancy objection. So, do you embrace pacifism in this very broad sense?
I do, and I'm rare in this respect. I mean, I think you're right to note that pacifism, while it sounds sort of nice, is in fact a radical moral doctrine. In fact, Tom Regan, in a piece sort of somewhat ironically titled In Defense of Pacifism, says pacifism is a false moral doctrine, if anything is. It's not hard to see why. I like the way that Jan Narveson put it years ago, which is that pacifists have too many friends and terrorists have too many enemies. Both of them have discrimination problems. Pacifism forbids us from killing would-be murderers in self-defense, but militancy permits us to slit the throat of a 17-year-old working a night shift at the zoo. And it seems like both of these are really quite counterintuitive. And that's with the radical nature of the proposal of the paper, which is that either way, we're going to have to bite some sort of counterintuitive bullet. But I do think that there is a less counterintuitive bullet to bite. And one of the things that I point out in the paper is that it does not seem to me that this is a good reason to reject animal rights, because these sort of problems can be found in other literatures as well. They can be found, for instance, in literature on the ethics of abortion. They can be found, when it comes to, freeing human slaves and things like that. These sort of problems can arise. So just as it's no good reason to reject, the moral status of human slaves, so also it's not a good reason to reject the moral status of non-human animals.
Now, as you say, there are some people who are prepared to defend something like a militancy option. So you mentioned Ivor Hardman, and again, worth mentioning that's a pseudonym. I don't know who that actually is. Also, the Steve Cook, he's defended something like that. Now, both Cook and Hardman defend a position that says something like this. While it may be permissible to use violence in defense of animals, just as it can be permissible to use violence in defense of people, it's normally not a good idea at all, as it's unlikely to be effective, and it may even be counterproductive. If I'm campaigning against zoos, I'm going to alienate a lot of my audience if it turns out, to use your example, I'm slitting the throat of 17-year-old people working at the zoo on night shifts. Presumably, you think that Cook and Hardman and others who endorse something like militancy should drop militancy and embrace pacifism, even though you suggested that both militancy and pacifism are viable options. So what do you have to say to them? What reasons do you think we have for favouring pacifism over militancy?
Well, so one thing I want to say is that I have a lot of sympathy for what Hardman and Cook say. So, for instance, I'm very sympathetic, actually, in fact, in total agreement with Steve Cook's remarks about the nature of terrorism. And say in the U.S., the FBI has labeled groups like the Animal Liberation Front as a domestic terrorist group or an international terrorist group. And that seems to me to be just fundamentally misguided. It doesn't seem to me that the ALF is a terrorist group insofar as they're, to my knowledge, both dedicated to and consistently pursuing nonviolent means. They do engage in forms of property destruction, but it does not seem to me that property destruction that does not result in the loss of life, or that doesn't result in anyone being harmed, any sentient beings being harmed, is properly labeled terrorism. And I agree with Hardman that there is a genuine problem here, right? It seems as though if we are going to accept some sort of strong view of animal rights, which I think we should, and I think the literature is trending in that direction, then we are going to have to ask hard questions about self-defense, about other defense, about what could possibly justify us in harming non-human animals in defense of ourselves or other human beings, and whether or not we would be permitted to harm other human beings in defense of animals. So all that to say, very sympathetic with the projects that they are pursuing. Now, in terms of, I guess, two things. So one is, you might interpret Cook and Hardman, right, and some others maybe to be endorsing a sort of success principle, right, where third-party violence is permissible against unjust aggressors only if that violence stands a reasonable chance of success. And perhaps you think that, ordinarily going into a factory farm, killing all of the human, workers there, freeing all the animals, that's not likely to be particularly effective. If anything, it will just result in a sort of escalation, right? Now factory farms will be staffed with guards, so on and so forth. So I think that might be sort of generally true. But it does seem to me that a couple of things still remain the case. Number one, there will still be some instances that violent direct action will not cause blowback, either because it's sort of like isolated case or a case nobody, right? You could cover up the evidence really well, or because just, the news cycle moves very quickly and wild things happen all the time. And animal rights really are not the front page of any news story. The other thing I think I want to say is that it's enough that there are some cases in which it would be permissible. So I think once Cook and Hardman and others concede that it would be permissible in some cases, but perhaps not advisable, they've sort of given away the game and are recognizing that there is a genuine problem here. And I think that those particular cases where it is permissible to use violence against other human beings to defend non-human animals, those cases are sufficient to generate this counterintuitive sort of worry that's constitutive of the militancy objection.
Let me try another angle then, another problem that gets raised in this conversation sometimes, because I'd be interested to hear your answer. So one approach might be to point out that animals seem to lose a lot less in being killed than do most humans. Or to put it in language that I might use, for example, animals have a lower interest in continued life than do most humans. And given that, we might want to argue that it's usually not permissible to kill humans in defense of animals, given that the human loses a lot more in being killed than does the animal being defended. You quote Jeff McMahon, for example, who makes these kinds of arguments in your paper. Do you think that ideas like that have the power to overcome the militancy objection?
No, I don't. So I think that the appeal of those sort of moves is that there's a sort of happy middle, right? We can say nice things about the value of non-human animals while also saying, well, their value is a little bit less than humans, and as a result, right, we're not permitted to kill humans in defense of animals. So two things I think that we can say in response to this. One thing we could say, that I do say in the paper, is that that's not going to account for the counterintuitive nature of some cases. So I provide one case, the sort of variant of the zookeeper case that I talk about in the paper. But I say, imagine this time that the zookeeper who's 17 years old is sick and only has a week to live, right? The pigs, by contrast, have decades to live. Well, in that sort of case, it seems as though the pigs, because they have more to live for, they have more to lose by being killed, whereas the human has less to be killed, right? So this sort of proportionality concern is really not going to be, it's not going to solve for those sorts of cases, and those sort of cases are sufficient to generate the militancy objection. And the other sort of concern is that, well, and this is something that Hardman talks about a little bit as well, which is what I call the Condorcet thesis. So even if you accept the Condorcet thesis, right, which I take to be something like, well, it's disproportionate to kill one human to save the life of one animal. Fine, you can accept that and still think that it would be proportionate to kill one human to save the lives of, say, a dozen animals, which is often what's at case, right? If you were to go to a factory farm, right, there are far more non-human animals there than there are human animals. If you were to kill, right, all of the humans there as a necessary means of saving all of the lives of all the animals there, seems to me that, right, there's a sort of additivity worry that at some point the value of enough animals is going to exceed the value or, right, the loss of a human life.
Yes, I see. So this is a very similar counter in many ways to the previous one. The worry seems to be that a non-pacifist approach to animal rights is always going to leave some room for militancy. It's always going to leave some room for endorsing the killing of humans or the maiming of humans or severe harm to humans in defense of animals. And that's enough to ground the militancy objection.
That's right. I think so. And like I said, I really do think that our intuitions are rather mixed here. On the one hand, I think that most people have the intuition that harming humans in defense of non-human animals is permissible in some cases. And then I think they have the intuition that it's not in other sorts of cases.
Yeah.
But the tricky thing is I don't think that those intuitions are really easily explained by either proportionality concerns, or whether it's really necessary, or vigilante concerns, or success, or things like that. I don't really think that that explains the difference in intuitions. And I construct a variety of cases in the paper to try to show that I think that's not really what's at issue here. Rather, I think fundamentally, we just have a conflicting set of intuitions, and that if we sort of assume an epistemic parity and suspend judgment at that point, then really what we would need to say is either pacifism or militancy is the right way to go here. It's hard to know which way to go. And then in the final section of the paper, I provide some reasons. I provide sort of some tiebreaker principles to suggest that pacifism is in fact the way to go.
Good. I mean, I was thinking about these tiebreaker principles, and well, do you want to introduce the tiebreaker principles?
Certainly. So the first one is what I call the assume endured rights principle, which I just define as follows. So if I know that someone had rights prior to now, and the possession of those rights would, if the person still had them, make it actually impermissible for me to harm them. And if there are now roughly equally good reasons to believe that that person currently has those rights, and equally good reasons to believe that they don't, then it's impermissible for me to harm that person. You might think that there are extremely controversial cases where you're not sure whether it's permissible to kill someone defensively, and so a lot of people defend precautionary principles. Essentially, what I am trying to say in this principle is that if you have equally good reasons to believe that someone has forfeited their rights, right, against being harmed, as you do for thinking that they still have those rights, well, then that's a case where you ought to assume that they still have those rights. So I think you need better reasons for thinking that someone has forfeited or otherwise lost their rights in order for it to be permissible to harm that person. The second principle that I defend is what I call the comparative threshold principle, which is a rather technical principle. I'll just sort of read it as I wrote it. So if the permissibility threshold is higher for K than for A, and if theory M implies the permissibility of K and P implies the permissibility of A, there's no view that's all things considered more plausible than M or P, and there's otherwise epistemic parity between M and P, then P is more plausibly true than M, which is a really, really big mouthful. But essentially what it says is that at its worst, if pacifism is false, at its worst, what it does is it allows us not to save people that we should save. And that's bad. It's bad not to save people who have a right to be saved. It's bad not to save people that we ought to save. So if it turns out that it's permissible to use violence to save them and we don't do it, then we've acted wrongly. But militancy at its very worst, it allows us to kill or seriously injure people that we are not permitted to kill. And I think that there are really good reasons for thinking that wrongful killing is morally worse than wrongful not saving. And so if you sort of assume agnosticism about the two positions, then this comparative threshold principle basically says, well, which one of these is intrinsically more likely to be true? Is it more likely to be true? Is the theory that permits at its worst wrongful not saving more likely to be true? Or is the principle that permits wrongful killing or wrongful maiming more likely to be true? And because one of those is intrinsically harder to justify than the other, I think the other one is intrinsically more likely to be true, and hence pacifism is intrinsically more likely to be true.
That's great. Those are really clever arguments. I really appreciate those. I was thinking about what kinds of possibilities we might have for a tiebreaker principle that pushes the other way. And I was thinking a little bit about the way that you rely, as you were just saying, on a lot of moral intuitions, and I'm quoting the paper here, background moral knowledge. And I suppose I started to wonder whether we might think that we should recognize that our moral intuitions and our background moral knowledge might be tainted by speciesism. So we might have a lot of moral intuitions and a lot of background moral knowledge that go against animals unjustly, unjustifiably, because of our speciesist upbringings or our speciesist societies or what have you. So do you think there's a danger in relying on these kinds of things given the fact that we probably have a speciesist intuitions?
So I do think that that's a genuinely serious concern. I think one of the tricky things is that we don't know which of our intuitions are speciesist and which aren't. I mean, some of them sometimes they're very clear cases, and sometimes they're right where our intuitions are clearly distorted by speciesism, and then there are other sorts of cases where it seems like they're clearly not. And it seems to me that these sort of defense cases are ones somewhere in the middle. It's hard to know whether they're clearly speciesist or not. So you could invoke a sort of epistemic tiebreaker there and say, well, other things being equal, we ought to assume that if we have to pick, right, if it's not super clear one way or another whether our intuitions are influenced by our sort of background speciesism or not, then we should assume that they are. But a couple of things about that. So, again, number one, I think that there genuinely are interesting problems for this animal rights literature that are mirrored in other literatures. I mentioned abortion, right, as one sort of case earlier, right, and there's still further cases like this. There was a lot of interesting literature on the ethics of, say, doing what John Brown did in the United States at Harper's Ferry and killing slave owners, freeing slaves, right? Whether acts of vigilantism like that are in fact permissible. So I think it's not clear that the sort of central conflicting intuitions here are fundamentally can be sort of explained away by appeals to speciesism, because speciesism is not going to neatly explain what's going on with our intuitions in those other sorts of cases. The second thing is that I'm of the view that not only are our intuitions sometimes distorted by speciesism, but our intuitions are also sometimes distorted by self-interest. It seems to me that a lot of people have intuitions that support the use of violent action in cases where we have really good reason to believe that it's plainly impermissible. And in short, I think that human beings often have intuitions, or their intuitions are influenced significantly by what's in their best interest, and that we could look at this question of animal rights, militancy, and pacifism. We could view it as sort of a case where our intuitions have gone awry just because we have these speciesist tendencies, and as a result, right, it's actually a clear case that our intuitions will really allow us to see. So we should just use the moral theory to kind of tell us what to think about, this particularly hazy case. But I actually view it somewhat differently, where I think that we actually are, as a species, a little too friendly toward violence. We're a bit too permissive. One thinks of standard ground laws. One thinks of how permissive we, right, particularly here in the U.S. and other places, we've been with war and, gun violence and so on in the United States and elsewhere. And it seems to me that animal rights might offer us an opportunity to say, perhaps our intuition that violence is not permissible in these sorts of cases, right, can actually lead us to seeing that violence is not permissible in a lot of other cases either. And that the intuitions which previously we thought supported the permissibility of violence in war and self-defense and so on are actually just misguided in some way and reflections of our own self-interest, or perhaps better explained by something else. So it seems to me that animal rights, this angle can actually offer us an opportunity to rethink our broader set of intuitions about violence than to just rethink our intuitions about animals.
Now, Blake, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I'm not confident about this, but I believe it was fragments of the 2nd century writer Celsus on the true doctrine, a discourse against the Christians. So So, against the Christian and Jewish views of humans as the sort of pinnacle of creation, Celsus appealed to the amazing collective rationality of honeybees who build and toil, right, with greater efficiency and success than human beings in many cases. And this struck a nerve with early Christian thinkers like Origen of Alexandria, whose book Contra Celsum contained a passage contending that Celsus's high view of honeybees is a hindrance to piety. I remember reading this in the course of reading a bunch of early Christian thinkers like Clement II and Origen and Tertullian and others. And all that remains of Celsus's work is in Origen's book, Contra Celsum. Those are the only fragments that remain. And the extent to which Origen was very concerned about human competition with honeybees is actually rather sort of stunning, but Celsus was a very big defender of non-human animals.
Oh, that's fascinating. I don't think we've had that answer before, so thanks for that. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I'm not sure if it's the first piece of pro-animal scholarship I ever wrote, but the first piece I ever published was for the journal Between the Species, in which I mounted a defense of ethical veganism from causal overdetermination worries.
And if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
All right, I'll break the rule and name two. The first is Karen Emmerman. Her work on ecofeminist conflicts of interest and moral remainders for sanctuaried animals has really significantly influenced, though not as much as Karen would like, the ways I think about ethical conflicts and the limits of our efforts to right the wrongs that we've done to animals. And the second is Cheryl Abate, whose work on violent conflicts with animals, in my view, asks all the right questions, even if our conclusions differ rather significantly.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
So many academics are posted at universities with animal labs. Still more are at universities with biology departments that acquire animal specimens for dissection and other laboratory pedagogy. I recommend working to supplant those practices, ideally in cooperation with biologists and other academics, but in opposition to them if necessary.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
So I think one of the defining features of the human-non-human animal relationship is the asymmetry in legal and political recognitions. Were it up to me, animals would be granted personhood under the law and would come into political power in some kind of substantive way. I'm agnostic about exactly what that would look like in practice, and there are lots of proposals on the table. But to me, that's sort of the first thing I would change.
What are you working on next?
So in terms of pro-animal stuff, I plan to reply to a forthcoming piece in the Journal of Analytic Theology by Dustin Crummett. Essentially, Crummett thinks that my defense of zootheism, which is the view that some non-human animals are divine, is actually compatible with Orthodox Christianity, whereas I claim otherwise. So I plan to respond to their arguments. At some point in the near future, I hope to apply pacifism to the problem of animal predation, or sometimes called the problem of carnivorous animals, which is a separate but important problem in the animal ethics literature.
And how can people find out more about your work?
They can visit my website at blakehereth.com. I post PDFs of all my published papers there and some unpublished ones as well, including a PDF of the online first copy of today's paper we've been talking about, Animal Rights Pacifism.
Well, thanks so much for joining us for Knowing Animals, Blake.
It's been a pleasure, Josh. Thanks so much.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. And don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast where you found us. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.